just about ready to proceed here. So, once again, we have a presentation by Dennis Spragg. Dennis wears a whole bunch of hats. If you saw the panel, you heard me say that he represents the Glenn Miller Estate, represents the Glenn Miller Archive in Boulder. He does a radio show. He's written a book, and he's going to give us this presentation about how Glenn found the sound. So here's Dennis Spragg.
And once again have to offer my regret for the technical facilities that we have here. We still don't have a line that can get up there to a podium. And so I can be up there pushing buttons and looking official. I have to be down here being informal. So I hope that's all right. So if any of this goes off the tracks, it's not intended. But anyway, Mike Delaney's over there laughing at me. So anyway,
we're with you all the way.
if you haven't had a chance already, please visit the Glenn Miller Birthplace Museum. We have put together with the Glenn Miller Birthplace Society a presentation called The Year They Found the Sound, 1939. After this, I don't have them in here right now, they're down in the office where you get your credentials. We have prepared leave-behinds, take-home booklets for you. That will be a compilation of what you see in the slideshow, but more importantly, what's in the presentation at the museum. In terms of how Glenn Miller evolved from a kid born in Clarinda, Iowa, raised by a family that moved to Nebraska, then to Missouri, and then to Fort Morgan, sugar beet country in Colorado. And he went from there to becoming America's #1 musician, who, as I pointed out earlier, somehow, some way, the 8th United States Army Air Force is lost. But that's another story. You have to get people to read that part of it. Right now, we're going to focus on Glenn's ascent to stardom and how he got there. We can't explain all of that in here, but I'm going to try to focus on the music. And that's where I beg your indulgence. Hopefully, our musical part of the program will work as we go through it. So I'd like you to join me on a journey, and from about 1904 through 1939, and then hopefully at the end we'll have time for a little discussion about Glenn.
With spotlights and celebrities, the Glen Island Casino opens its 1939 season. Let's listen to Glenn Miller's music.
Many people have told us over the years that this is their favorite picture of Glenn Miller. So that's why it started right off the bat. He's obviously very happy about something that's happening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight there comes music from beside the waters of Long Island Sound. NBC's microphones are present at Glenn Miller's smart opening in the Glen Island Casino, Mecca of music for moderns, just off the Shore Road in New Rochelle, New York. Now may we offer our invitation to dance to the music of one of America's foremost swing trombonists and ace arrangers, Glenn Miller and his orchestra.
This program today is dedicated to Alan Cass and Steve Miller. And I think that's very appropriate to do so. Without them, we wouldn't be here. So I want everyone to remember them, and I hope that we never forget what they brought us. And I'm going to crack up, so I'll just keep going. And pass that one. What you just heard was the end result of a climb that was not necessarily ever going to happen, perhaps unpredictable, and perhaps unexpected. But then again, if you go back and take a backward look with clear hindsight, it was probably inevitable. We are dealing with a very talented young man who was very organized. He had that gift right from the beginning, had a clear mind about things. I think part of it was because his father had failed in life, and he was very aware of it. Nothing against Louis Elmer, but he struggled with alcohol and with some other things that happened in life. And his son, I think, was embedded by his mother and by their experience to be tough. Remember, this was a family that moved from Clarinda when Glenn was 2 to the middle of Nebraska. Steve and I used to always joke that there might have been a reason why there was a 10-year gap between Glenn and a 9-year gap between Glenn and his younger siblings. That maybe Matty Lou was mad at Elmer and said, until we straighten things out here, I'm not going any further. There's a picture here. The picture you see is Glenn to the left with his brother Dean, Dr. Dean Miller, and their newborn sibling Herb, John Herbert Miller. That's one of the best pictures of Glenn that's ever been taken. And then Glenn in his football uniform, he was an all-state end at Fort Morgan High School. People don't know that things had turned out a bit differently. Maybe Glenn Miller would have played football at college. But he gravitated to music. Glenn had some things going for him when he hit the University of Colorado. He didn't stay very long. People say to me, well, he flunked out after one semester. First of all, he never flunked out. That's not true. He got involved in music, and he had musical gigs, and he got into bands. He worked with a man named Holly Moyer, who had been a World War I veteran, who had been in the Navy, and taught Glenn a lot about presentation style, dress, grooming, and how to perform on the stage. That's a picture of Glenn with Boyd Sector's band, which he traveled with. That's when he left school and went out with Boyd. But the picture in the upper left is the reason why Glenn Miller became a superstar. That would be Helen Berger. I'm going to crack up again. She was a lovely woman. And the only reason I kind of choke up at this point in the presentation is because I've had the privilege and the honor to be trusted by Joan Miller with her parents' private correspondence. And I will tell you, without beyond any doubt, and someday when we get permission, I hope that we can have a book of their letters to one another, particularly when he was in England during World War II. Do not have any doubt that Helen was the brains behind the operation. Glenn was brilliant, but Helen was firm, she was focused, and she was a very great judge of character. And that's why Steve maybe was a black and white personality, because his mother could be just as firm, although nice, as her husband. Now Glenn got a big break in 1924-25 time period. He went out to California and he joined the band of Ben Pollock, who at that time was one of America's most popular bands. And then it would go from there. We're going to take a little journey through Glenn's professional development. What you will hear are all these bands perform before he arranged the music. So you'll be hearing him develop. That would be Glenn on the right side of this picture. Imagine George Gershwin trusting this young arranger with his part of his Broadway show. Interesting. I missed. Sorry about that. Hello Lola. Ben sometimes said this was the best solo he ever played. On his tune. No, that's Frederick Tanzer. Now we'll go to the Dorsey Brothers. One's greatest tune of all time.
Well, here's the thing that Fanny did. We'll give you a laugh. Fanny built a house, but it didn't have a bath. So Annie called around one day, and she said to Fanny, "That's a very funny house, my dear. It's so uncanny." I like Fanny, I go Fanny, and it's my
There he is.
Now, Annie's cousin Fanny is a sweetie of mine. She stays at home and waits for me all the time. You may know some girls named Annie that are divine, but you never saw a Fanny half as pretty as mine.
Well, as we all know, Glenn was the referee between Tommy and Jimmy during the period that they were working together. And of course, Tommy then got mad and walked off the bandstand at Glen Island Casino. Of course, I think Tommy wasn't really mad. He plotted that move. So Glenn went on. He went on to work for an Englishman named Ray Noble, who was coming over to the United States with his singer Al Bowley to form a band in America because of the. I'm going to take a pause here and explain that there are a certain thing in those days. The musicians' unions in the United States and Britain didn't get along that well. American musicians were discouraged from performing in Britain and vice versa, so Ray had to hire a band. Glenn was recommended to him, and Glenn became de facto assistant director, if you will, of Ray's band. And you hear the music progressing as we go along. It's getting a little more sophisticated, a little deeper, a little richer. Let's go ahead and kneel and next to Ray. lives in London in 1940. Very, very sad. He would have gone on and been great. He would have been back here and probably been a very prominent singer in the post-war era. It's too bad. So Glenn, at the time he was working for Ray Noble, Glenn went to school. But if you read his notebooks that are in the Glenn Miller archives, you will find that you might want to scratch your head and say, who's the teacher? Because you listen, you not listen, you read these things and you see Glenn's editing pencil, I've said this before, the blue ink and the red ink, and the questions he's written down to ask Schillinger. And Glenn, it's funny because you look at all of Glenn's exercises with Dr. Schillinger, who was at the time, many of you know, a prominent music educator. He, George Gershwin was one of his students, Oscar Levant was one of his students. I often jokingly say Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey went to school with Schillinger and it only lasted 1 week, which is true. They went for a couple lessons and left. Glenn went for a couple of years. And, but Glenn developed a lot of thinking, of mathematical thinking in music. The one subject Glenn was good in high school and at CU was math. And Schillinger had a mathematical process for music, and I think that was something that they were simpatico in. And while he was there, he wrote something that he jotted out called Miller's Tune. Well, Miller's Tune becomes Moonlight Serenade. It's the first version, and it was going to go through other reiterations and other names and types of lyrics for it. But this was the first time that Glenn started fiddling around with that. Now, in 1937, Glenn and Helen decided that it might be time for Glenn to quit working for other people and organizing their bands and starting his own. It was a risky, adventurous, and expensive exercise, and Glenn had on the table a letter from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios in Hollywood inviting him to join their music department. Imagine how history would have been different if Glenn had gone to Hollywood and written music for motion pictures rather than become a leader of his own band. But they took the plunge, and in 1937, they went for it.
Wistful and blue, in spite of all I can do, I keep on thinking of you. The joy you brought to me, just a sweet memory. I gave you my best, but you were just like the rest. You left me lonely and blue, heartbroken too, wistful and blue for you.
Glenn was booked by the Rockwell O'Keefe Agency, which became Turner Amusements shortly thereafter. And they booked him into hotels in Boston, New Orleans, Dallas, and Minneapolis. The Nicolette, Minneapolis, the Adolphus in Dallas, the Roosevelt in New Orleans, and the Raymore in Boston. Those were all what they called Rockwell O'Keefe hotels. Bands that they booked went into those hotels. Glenn was not happy with that itinerary because they obviously didn't put him into New York. They probably didn't feel comfortable or confident in the New York venues with this band. The band had a lot of veteran musicians in it. There was heavy drinking. There were personnel issues. There was even, in the trade press at the time, and I'm not inventing this, there were rumors about Kathleen Lane, the singer, being a disruptive influence. Number of issues with the band. Tommy Dorsey invested in Glenn, but Tommy Dorsey had a catch and a hook. And that was his manager, Arthur Michaud, was going to be put in as Glenn's manager. And Arthur was basically Tommy's spy and Tommy's enforcer. And Tommy believed he owned Glenn. And Glenn believed it was an investment. Well, Mike Neidorff, who was the agent at Rockwell O'Keefe, fought for the account. And he took creative steps to fight for the account. He brought in an investor named Cy Schridman, a ballroom operator in Boston. And basically, size investment paid off Tommy. A lot of people didn't appreciate that over time in the histories that have been written about this. Tommy didn't go quietly, but he did go. Then they went on, the band regrouped. Helen, I have to point out, Helen had a bad operation, very serious operation. So Glenn suspended the band at the end of 37. People call it a failure. It was not an artistic failure. The band was actually pretty good. And it wasn't exactly a financial failure, although Glenn lost money. They could have kept going, but what Glenn did was there was a 3-month hiatus to hire new personnel, younger, more, well, shall we say, controllable, leadable, if you will. And also, it gave Glenn the opportunity for Mike to put things together to get rid of Dorsey and that entire poisonous atmosphere. Because what Dorsey had wanted to do was move the band to Music Corporation of America, his booking agency. So, with fresh investment and fresh impetus, Glenn launched his new band in the spring of 38, and guess what? It worked. Sounds a little different than 37, doesn't it?
And now, with Glenn Miller and his orchestra, his own original theme, which has no name, is played for you as a number. Glenn? Ladies and gentlemen, you have the privilege of naming the theme melody for Glenn Miller and his orchestra.
They did get letters.
A dance program played by Glenn Miller with Gail Reese and Ray Everly as vocalists at the Paradise Restaurant, the heart of the Great White Way in Manhattan, New York City.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Welcome to Network Radio. On this slide, you will see Glenn Miller posing to sign his RCA Victor recording contract. They put him on the Bluebird label, the 35-cent label, as opposed to the Victor 50-cent label. There are RCA executives in the picture, but the reason this is here is to point out what I believe are the two most important people, business-wise, that Glenn Miller ever met and who did the most to promote him and establish him as America's #1 musician. The first is Agent Mike Nydorf, who's on the left. Mike left GAC, was in Hollywood and became a major force in Hollywood and represented a number of talent, leading talent in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. You might have seen his name before. He was a big deal. Next to Mike is attorney David McKay Sr., who actually worked for Victor. And then Glenn somehow or some other way induced David to go into private practice. And David was Glenn's attorney, and then Helen's attorney, and the estate attorney for the rest of his life. And then David probably did more to perpetuate Glenn Miller's legacy than any single human being that ever lived. This was a big deal, signing this contract. You had radio exposure now, you had records going to be made. This band was now poised to succeed. So they went into Frank Daly's Meadowbrook. Frank Daly was a former band leader that had the dance hall in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, in Meadowbrook. And he did very well. He also had the Terrace Room in Newark.
Now we come to the next number, and it seems to me, spreading chemistry. I used to know a poem about that. What about this next number, Ben? Well, I'll tell you, it's a little number that we made a record of today, and we think it's going to be a big hit. There's an accompanying dance to go with it, which of course you can't see over the radio, but we'll play the number, and we'll let you imagine the dance. Want a little vocal on it too? Yes, Marion, I'm going to sing. Okay, count them off. I need the spreading chestnut.
You're about to hear the #1 reason why the band succeeded at Glen Island. Mary. Her presence with that band on the dance game cannot be underestimated.
There beneath the ball street used to meet, all his kisses were so sweet, all the little birdies went tweet tweet. I said I love you, and there ain't no way to
Now we come to the next number, and it seems to me. Now we come to the next number, and it seems to me, spreading chemistry.
I think we had 2 audio things. We're going to get a rerun here. Sorry about that.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a little number that we made a record of today, and we think it's going to be a big hit. There's an accompanying dance to go with it, which of course you can't see over the radio, but we'll play the number, and we'll let you imagine it.
That gentleman standing behind Marion in this picture will be Jan's father.
Okay, come off. I need the spreading chestnut.
Underneath spreading chestnut tree, I loved him and he loved me. There I used to sit up on his knee. There beneath the ball street used to meet, all his kisses were so sweet, all the little birdies went tweet tweet. I said I love you, and there ain't no ifs or buts. He said I love you, and the blacksmith shouted, chestnut! Underneath the spreading chestnut tree, there he said he'd marry me. Now you ought to see our family.
This broadcast is from the night of April 4th, 1939. Something happened that morning. Glenn and the band went into RCA Studios in New York and made a couple of records. One of which was the recorded version of the theme that now had a name, Full Night Serenade. And they had gone through a number of reiterations and a bunch of lyrics. but Mr. Parrish finally wrote the ones that the record company wanted, and so the rest is history. That's a picture of Glenn that's posed, going over some contractual paperwork that Frank Daly has met on the wall. Now Frank brought Glenn into the Meadowbrook to preempt Michael DeZutter, who was the owner of Glen Casino, because on Glenn's birthday, March 1st, 1939, he got a birthday present. Mike Nightover came in and said, "You've been hired by Mike DeZutter for the summer season, May 17th through August 23rd of 1939. This is a big deal, because you had a hard wire from NBC, Radio City, to New Rochelle, New York, and the band was going to be on the air almost every night." And a gentleman many of you may have met here at these meetings back in the 80s and 90s, Tom Shields, was a student at Allen College, and he was an acquaintance of DeZutter, and he was an acquaintance of Mike Nightover, and he brought them together. So Tom, who was later hired by Glenn in his business office, had a lot to do with this. So this was the breakthrough. This was when the band made it.
The National Broadcasting Company invites you to listen to Glenn Miller's music.
Maybe a little more polish, a little better together. It's coming along.
From the Glen Island Casino, overlooking Long Island Sound, just off the Shore Road in New Rochelle, New York.
The NBC engineers did a great job with this broadcast.
Another Glenn Miller conception of modern rhythm, the 1 o'clock jump. The National Broadcasting Company.
NBC had two networks, red and blue. The blue is what became ABC. Government ordered it divested in 1941. You cannot underestimate the impact this band had on listeners in Iowa, Washington State, Texas, New York, North Carolina. The entire network was carrying music. That would be Glenn Miller on trombone. And there's a little more torque in it, is because the drummer is more thorough and by now had joined us. They're almost as good as Nick. singers that were starting to come out from this band. And many people don't know, you might think, "Oh, Nice Serenade" was our first best-selling record. "Wishing Will Make It So" was the first #1 hit this band recorded. And it would be the first of 17 #1 hits in 1939. I mean, talk about immediately coming out of nowhere and becoming a great band. These guys hit and hit fast.
From the way Glenn Miller plays it, that's jump music for any old time, not only 1 o'clock.
Now, special treats coming up. We have something that was only done once, as far as I know. Moonlight Serenade, of course, had lyrics put against it. George Simon wrote the first set of lyrics that were rejected, and then Parrish came along with the lyrics. We're about to hear Ray Eberly do something that was not done, I don't think, on any other broadcast, and we're about to hear it right now. I think that might have been improvised, or not necessarily, but I don't know. Don't know. So, the band goes on. They're doing very well in Long Island in the summer of 1939, and on August 1st, they recorded something called In the Mood. In the Mood, Joe Garland tune, was shopped around with a lot of bands. It had a long lineage, which we've described before, and written by an African-American named Joe Garland. An opportunity to hear it live at the Meadowbrook and the enthusiastic audience, which by now knows who they are. stage came up and down, and everybody filled the theater. The band came up and appeared on this riser. And this would be a breakthrough for Glenn. He did very well, broke all kinds of records. But he was also going to do something which was also that we don't today appreciate as a great artistic breakthrough, which I'll mention in a minute. The audience is singing along. Now, I mentioned earlier something had happened at Paramount, which we don't today appreciate. Glenn went on a double bill with the Ink Spots, the 4 Ink Spots. They were the extra added attraction at the time. They're African Americans. This didn't normally happen. Glenn took a big chance doing this. He also promoted their careers. They gave him a gold watch at the end of the engagement, which was extended by the Paramount because they were doing so well. This really made the Ink Spots into a national act. This really boosted their careers, and they never forgot Glenn for it. For these stage shows, so that the Ink Spots and the band synced perfectly together, Glenn had arranger Eddie Durham write arrangements for the spots to sing with the band. Unfortunately, none of the performances at the Paramount with the Glenn's band and the Ink Spots exist, which is a shame. That would be wonderful to hear. Well, Eddie Durham was also somebody who I need to mention at this point, because if you go back and look at who the arranger was on many of the swing tunes, particularly, that the band played in 1939 and drove it to prominence and caused that radio audience to pay attention to them, was Eddie Durham. He had Count Basie fame and Jimmy Lunsford fame. Again, a little appreciated fact about Glenn, who people in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s would often say, well, he's kind of racist, and he doesn't like Jews, and he doesn't like Italians, and he doesn't this and that. But guess what? He was fine. He was a good man. And look at this. Something we don't today appreciate about Glenn. Glenn went on to Carnegie Hall for an ASCAP concert. RCA Victor issued a record of a recording that was made for it. Interestingly, it was recorded by NBC, but not broadcast by NBC. Why, I don't know, but it was not broadcast that night of October 6th of 39, but we do have, the RCA put out the edited version of the broadcast. The full broadcast does exist in the archives. Now, once again, this was not, like I said, not broadcast, but at least we have the recording of it, and we know what it sounded like. Now, in November of 1939, the band went back to Meadowbrook for a second engagement. And I want to play something here briefly as we go to wrap the program up and give you a little bit of a taste of what the band was doing headed into 1940, now that they were prominent and popular and America's #1 band. This is a little diversion, but I think it's a real object lesson in Glenn the man. Glenn Miller appreciated people who appreciated him. He was devoted to people who he thought were talented and that he respected. And I'm just going to let something play out that I think is very touching.
Now we're about to hear one of those grand specialties in rhythm, but before we do, I'd like to present to you, ladies and gentlemen, my friend and yours, our rising young maestro, Glenn Miller himself. Come in, Glenn.
Thank you, Bill. Good evening, everyone. As most of you have probably heard this particular week, there's a gentleman who has spent 20 years a credit to the music business. He's a very famous leader, and we'd like to put in our small tribute to our friend Paul Whiteman. He's done a great thing for music. He made possible the present-day bands by pioneering the way 20 years ago this week. And in final tribute to him, we'd like to say that we're one half the credit to the music business that Paul Whiteman has been. We'll be very happy. Here's Bill to tell you about the next number.
Well, our sentiments are the same line in regards to Paul Whiteman, Glenn. Well, now, folks, this rhythmic special that I was talking about is one that's often requested by our Meadowbrook patrons as well as our listeners. Glenn Miller and his grand arrangement of the Little Brown Jug.
Hey! Hey! Yeah, yeah. Hey! Yeah, yeah.
Mr. Whiteman recommended Glenn as a successor of the Chesterfield program. Glenn was about to get a network radio. Mr. Whiteman's vocal group is the Four Modernaires. The Four Modernaires became Glenn Miller's vocal group. Mr. Whiteman and his wife Margaret Livingston Whiteman adopted their children from the Cradle Society of Evanston, Illinois. They recommended the Cradle Society of Evanston, Illinois to help. Excuse me. So Mr. Whiteman has something to do with Steve and John. He was, by all accounts, a wonderful man. Excuse me. Cut it off. I didn't mean to cut it off, but that's all right. You know what Jug sounds like, and that's a nice picture of Glenn, I think, taken from this time period. And this is the, I was going to wrap this up with this. The announcer on this was Bill Abernathy. And you might be able to make Bill out there on stage right underneath the name Bill Abernathy is a rather lanky-looking gent with white hair. Interesting story. Bill was one of NBC's original announcers. He was with the network all the way from the beginning. So, and he was usually the man who did broadcasts from the Meadowbrook. He later, the voice will be familiar to you, he did the Sunset Serenades from the Cafe Rouge with Glenn. So I mentioned that Glenn, with the help of Mr. Whiteman, now has a network radio program as we end 1939, and it's with the Andrews Sisters. And they paired the band with the Andrews Sisters for the first 13 weeks of the broadcast. I was going to play some music here on the Chesterfield show, but I don't see the audio thing here, so I'm just going to go through it. What I intended to play for you was the beginning of a Chesterfield show and show an object lesson about if Glenn and the Andrews Sisters really got along. It's the beginning of one of the Chesterfield shows where the sisters are with the band. They're with it for the first 13 weeks because the sponsor and the network wanted to hedge their bets about Glenn and the band. And so Glenn was, I shouldn't say stuck with them, but from his point of view, he was stuck with them for 13 weeks. He had the same attitude towards Gardner show in 1944, but we can get into that later. In any event, Glenn, on this occasion, and that's his announcer, Paul Douglas. I'm sorry, Paul's voice isn't being heard now, it's me. Introducing the show with Glenn and America's #1 vocal group, the Andrews Sisters. But then, Mo Pirtle goes into a drum roll, and up pops a new tune Glenn introduces called Book It, sung by Marion Hutton. Now, think about this for a minute. He's got the Andrews Sisters, America's #1 vocal group, on his program, and he starts to show off with Marion. I leave you to deduce all of that. I wanted to put this up because that's one of my favorite pictures of her. That captures her personality on the bandstand. Now that's a later picture. That's taken from the Cafe Rouge. You can tell by the bandstands in the back that you saw the other day with the pickup band here. And that's, of course, a CBS microphone. And that's the band in the Chesterfield rehearsal. I think this is a kind of funny picture. Glenn and Paul were talking about something. The guys in the band appear to be playing. I don't know what they're playing. And Marion's reading the paper. That's an interesting picture. So the band ends the year. There's some stories about whether the guys were dragooned into doing it, but they give Glenn a new Buick for Christmas because to show their appreciation. They all chipped in. Some of the guys wanted to do it, and some of the guys didn't want to do it, but they did it. And they go into the Cafe Rouge in Hotel Pennsylvania, New York, and there's an Artie Shaw connection that Reinhard will appreciate. Artie Shaw opened the new Cafe Rouge, which was a successor to the Manhattan Room that Benny Goodman had done so well. And Artie was supposed to be there from October through New Year's, and then Glenn was the second act that was coming in. Artie didn't make it to the end of the engagement. He walked away in November. It wasn't as precipitous as a decision as it's been alleged over the years in the media. You can find out all about Artie on our website, Glenn Miller Archives. Reinhard has been gracious to share all of his Artie research with us, and we have a nice Artie Shaw history there. So anyway, Glenn starts at the Cafe Rouge, and I'm going to end this and just let the credits run, and you can see some things that will, hopefully with this audio, will work. We're at the Cafe Rouge. It is after the New Year of 1940, and this is now America's #1 band.
Undoubtedly, you're not a pagan, or we wouldn't even speak to you. However, as you listen to Glenn Miller's astounding arrangement of the pagan love song, you must admit it's got its points.
Credits that the music would have rolled over. I want to acknowledge the fact that the images you have seen in this presentation are courtesy of Ed Polich. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Sony Legacy, they're not here, but I thank them for them, I suppose. And if you want to know more about Glenn, there's some books out, one book out and another one coming out at the end of November from the University of Nebraska Press. It goes on from the story of Glenn himself to the story of the media-government alliance that President Roosevelt fostered in the Second World War. And it's a quite different environment than what we have now in terms of everybody getting on the same page. So it's an interesting story, a lot of interesting things we didn't know about in the past. So that's it. That's how Glenn climbed to the top and got to the top and has stayed there for the rest of eternity, I guess. Moment, if anybody has any questions.
I was always curious, why did he never go back to
That's a good question, but if you look at the itinerary of the band after that, I think Glenn was not wanting to be focused in the summer months on the New York area. Remember, he was booked into ballrooms and hotels all over the United States. So in 1940, they went to the Wardman Park in Washington for a while. Then they went out to Chicago and played in Chicago and toured all over the Midwest. In 41, they toured across the country on their way out to do the movie in Hollywood, Sun Valley Serenade. 42, they toured all over the country. I mean, they came back and then did the Café Rouge in the fall of those years. But I think it was to get national exposure. And from a selfish point of view, I think they made a lot more money on the road. Remember in the movie Orchestra-Wise where Glenn says we make our money and our reputation on the road, and he talks about the kids that buy our records and they want to hear our music. I think he actually believed that.
A few years ago, there was a group here festival called 557, a radio show. And for the first time I ever heard the lyrics of the movie. I heard radio lyrics. Do we know if the lyrics of that piece, were there lyrics in the movie?
Absolutely. The Bluebird issued 2 in the Moods in 1939. One was Glenn Miller and his orchestra, and the cover, made by the same label, were the 4 King sisters with the Rhythm Rays, which was part of Albino Ray's band. And they sang in, there's a record of In the Mood by the King sisters that Victor issued in 39. And I would highly recommend it. It's the full lyric.
Do you know the beginning, the first part of the lyric?
Yeah.
That's all, Mr. What you call it?
Yeah. Yep. Yes, David. Sorry.
See here in the mood was all the words mostly some, not all of them.
Right. Excellent. David? Sorry.
In popular press, always likes to create rivalries between bands, their musical celebrities. Somebody's always nipping at your heels. So, in 1938, they sold the idea that Artie Shaw was nipping at Benny Goodman's heels. So I'm wondering, as 39 win 40, in your estimation, who was nipping at Glenn Miller's heels?
No one. Not until 41.
He sucked up all the oxygen.
Yeah, well, if you look at the best-selling records of 1940, it's all Glenn, all the time. You look at the #1 Billboard through the whole year, Glenn, 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 Glenn. It changes in 41. Jimmy Dorsey is suddenly dominant. And there's a reason. It's the ASCAP BMI situation where the music licensing agency, ASCAP, the radio industry had a feud with them over rights payments, and they banned ASCAP music from the air. So starting in the fall of 40, starting in September, NBC had a policy where on Glenn's broadcasts, they would phase out ASCAP music so that if there were 8 tunes in a half-hour sustaining broadcast, you had to play 2 non-ASCAPs. Then you had to play 3 non-ASCAPs. And by the end of the year, it was none. That's why Glenn developed a new theme, Slumber Song. Well, Jimmy hit on the idea of the vocals with Bob Everly and Helen O'Connell and a lot of Latin music. This is a reason why Xavier Cugat suddenly became very popular in the United States and his records sold very well. Because most music by Latin composers was not ASCAP music. And they all signed with BMI, and so you suddenly had in 1941, a lot of the top tunes were Latin-themed tunes. Americanized versions of long-standing tunes that were older that had been dusted up and now played. So Jimmy usurped him then. But then Glenn recovered towards the fall of 41, and then we get into 42. And I always joke with Rick on the program, starting from Chattanooga Choo Choo hitting #1, It's Interrupted 1 Week by Elmer's tune, you go for like 6 months and it's like Chattanooga, String of Pearls, Moonlight Cocktail, bam, 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 and it's all Glenn again. So Glenn had a dip and then he came back. But some funny thing about Artie and Glenn, Artie was #1 when Glenn's band comes in and starts making all this noise. And Artie isn't in New York at the Astor or at the Hotel Edison or at the Meadowbrook or wherever to compete with Glenn. No, Artie's in California. And Artie's in the Palomar, he's at different places in LA, he's making a movie Dancing Co-ed, and he's at a disadvantage. because the NBC wires, he's not on the air on NBC at 8:30 Pacific time, 11:30 Eastern time. He's on at 11:30 on the coast, and he's only on the NBC Orange network, which is their Western affiliates. So Artie's suddenly at a disadvantage. Then Artie goes to San Francisco, and as you pointed out the other day, Artie's getting no haircut. We don't have any surviving Artie Shaw programs. We don't know how much he was on the air. You'd have to go back and look at the logs. Point is, by the time you get to the fall of '39, and who's nipping at whose heels? It's Glenn nipping at Artie. Artie's at the Strand Theater, and Glenn's at the going into the Cafe Rouge. Anyway, Glenn's at the Meadowbrook. You've got issues. All of a sudden, you've got Glenn up against Artie. You see. And Artie goes into Cafe Rouge. Artie walks away and hands it to Glenn. So, nobody was nipping at Glenn's heels in the 40.
I do have a follow-up, and I'll give it to Mike.
Go ahead. And Mike.
In
He's
40,
patient.
You've got, Tommy Dorsey's been established now 4 or 5 years. And
Kind of.
Glenn has sort of moved into Tommy's turf and commercial. He's got a dozen or so ballad hits. He's got some instrumental hits. Tommy is sort of the name on everybody's lips after Goodman, after Shaw. But Miller comes in and takes some of Tommy's air. At least that's how it seems to me. But Tommy's always number 2 at that point.
Yes, and if you listen to Tommy Dorsey's band in the summer of '39 at the Pennsylvania Hotel in New York, you have the style that Tommy was playing in '37, '38, and '39 with Jack Leonard and Edith Wright, and as somebody mentioned earlier, by the fall of '39, there's no more Jack Leonard. There's no more Edith Wright. And suddenly we hire Sinatra. We hire Connie Haynes. They go through Alan DeWitt and somebody else. But the point is, and they hire Cy Oliver, and suddenly Tommy's band sounds completely different. So would you suggest that he was reacting to Glenn? Maybe. Tommy was very competitive, probably the most competitive band leader that ever lived. Now, and Tommy was probably tired of always being second or third or fourth. He wanted to be one. But Glenn shows up and Glenn's one. So that had to get under his skin a little bit. Mike?
Now, what is a true story of the clarinet lead? The movie had the cotton lip on the trumpet player, but what is the true story?
It evolved. It was evolutionary. As I point out in the Glenn Miller book briefly, you have several occasions. There was an injury. There was one of the stages of the evolution where Glenn had to substitute clarinet for trumpet because the trumpet player was hurt.
Oh, so there's some truth to that.
And the Doors, but that wasn't his own band. That was when he was arranging for somebody else. And then it took another step in his 1937 band where he then had Irving Frizzola sitting around, one of the people who was a problem. And he didn't have anything to do. He was a great clarinet player, but Glenn didn't have anything for him to do because the band was not, the arrangements weren't written for that. So he plugged his clarinet in and said, you play these with the clarinet. So that was a further evolution. But where it really evolved to the point where Glenn then hires the 38 band, and one of the members of the 38 band is Wilbur Schwartz. Mm-hmm. And Wilbur Schwartz, the way he played, fit the evolutionary pattern that Glenn developed, and suddenly you had somebody that played it beautifully, and that's what Jeff. It didn't happen all at once. Jeff?
Yeah, to kind of extend on that, arguably, Glenn's greatest strengths were as an organizer, a chooser of talent, and a blender of talent. And you saw this all the way through how he picked the people, because the 37 band was a whole bunch of individuals printed on the stars. Frizzola, calling him a problem was a little like calling K2 a small pill. But all the way through to the Air Force band, everything he was doing was looking for people who were both stars, but also could work as members of a unit. And I was wondering if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Ed interviewed Norm Layden. They used to play on a loop in here in the library, and I hope we can get those discs back on there, because the interviews with Paul Tanner, with Norm Layden, the arranger from the Army Air Forces band, were very good. Layden said in that interview that, when asked, about Glenn, he said, Miller told Layden, it's not what you write, it's what you don't write. And what Layton's conclusion was, and I wholeheartedly agree, that Glenn's number one skill was editing. It might have frustrated Bill Finnegan, but it synced in very well with Jerry Gray. And Norm didn't have a problem with it. Ralph Wilkinson didn't have a problem with it. Billy May probably didn't have a problem with it. Billy was allowed to do what he needed to do with his skills and talents. And Bill actually was as well. So I think it's a combination of factors, but I would say his state of mind, his focus, and his self-discipline. Glenn didn't ask anyone else anything that he didn't demand of himself. And my case in point would be later in his career in the Army Air Forces, when he had respiratory issues that finally caught up with him. He had chronic respiratory issues, and he was diagnosed with a severe case, it turned out to be, of pneumonia. People think, gee, he lost a lot of weight in England, and they chalk it up to lung cancer or something. It was nothing of the kind, it was pneumonia. But Glenn took himself out of the trombone section at that time and said, I'm not up to this. I'm going to lead the band, but you would see him for stage performances in England, he had to fake it. He felt, if I can't be up to the level of professionalism that I demand of this band, then I'm not gonna fake it. I'm gonna demand of myself the same thing. So I think his self-discipline was his number one characteristic. Mike, again.
On the editing factor, there are recordings of the original in the movie, which is about 7 minutes long, and it kept repeating. It was getting boring. But to get it onto an RCA record, that only had 2.5 to 3 minutes, he had to edit it down.
Chop.
And that made it a classic.
Yeah, that's right.
Instead of 11 minutes, it was 2.5, 3 minutes.
Yes, earlier you mentioned critic opinion of Glenn Miller. Has that ever changed in the present day when they recognize his talents?
I think Glenn is more respected now than he ever was.
I think so.
I don't, remember, a lot of that crowd's dead. I shouldn't put it that way, but they died off. And you listen to, watch tonight the swing dancers and watch the young people show up for that. And go around the country, and if anybody mentions bands, and other people have talked about this the last couple of days, you don't hear people talking about Tommy Dorsey or Benny Goodman or Artie Shaw, sorry. They know the name Glenn Miller. When you think of this era, because I think that the sound transcended the era. And because McKay kept it alive, legally and business-wise. Helen wanted it kept alive. Ray McKinley had a big part in this. And now Nick, Larry O'Brien before Nick. Remember, there's no other band that travels and is as visible. So I think we've passed that era where now there are still going to be, and there are, people dismissive of Glenn. Part of it, I butted up with this on my Glenn Miller book because somebody said, gee, you didn't get into, I was on a panel and they said, you didn't get into musical criticism of Glenn. He just copied African Americans, and there's this thing about all African American bands and artists are automatically better than all the white bands. And I'm like, that's kind of reverse prejudice. That's reverse prejudice, I think, to say that. So that's still there, where people say that. And part of it is, look, Glenn played it right down the middle. He did, as Ed has always said to me, Glenn played legitimate, good jazz tastefully. And he blended it with the ballads. And it's no crime to be number one in the Billboard top 10. And then, you look at 1940 and see 5 things in the top 10. You see 10 top tunes and 5 of them with Glenn Miller. I mean, Count Basie never did that. Duke Ellington never did that. Jimmy Lunsford never did that. That's no slight at them, nor should it be a slight on Glenn.
Correct.
His commercial success condemned him among academics.
From the beginning, different bandstands. How many used Glenn Miller, and where are the bandstands now?
Who knows? I don't know. They're probably all long gone. Because you're right, there were different bandstands at the Cafe Rouge, Meadowbrook, Glen Island. Well, all different. Until the Pennsylvania Railroad made the ones you just saw work with. Yeah.
Was Glenn stated, did he state, or was it known that he stated, and told his band, all his bands, you never can play sweet enough. You always think when you're playing, you never can play sweet enough. Oh, okay.
I've heard that. I can't tell you he actually said that, but he could have. It sounds like him.
Some of the fellows told me in letters, more than a few, one of his favorite axioms. In the Air Force referencing, always use a red pencil in rehearsal. Always. But Captain Miller's axiom was, when in doubt, leave it out.
That's true. In Glenn's book, the orchestral arranging book that he published in 1943, Glenn says in the book, very interesting, his comment is that the most important part of the arranging process and having a successful band is rehearsals. And he would rehearse them, but here's the interesting part about it, and you know this, Glenn, from the letters. Members of the Army Air Force's orchestra looked forward to the rehearsals because the rehearsals were actually interesting and entertaining to them. And Paul Tanner used to say that, that the band did not dislike the rehearsals. Glenn was a stickler about them, but they learned things and they came together and gelled. But apparently, I think that's what confused the string players. We've always told this story. The Army Air Force has sent orders to all these men that had come from, the New York Toscanini's NBC Symphony Orchestra, the Cleveland Symphony, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they're ordered to Glenn Miller, and they're like, why? That's not us. And they get there and they get into rehearsals, and they were shocked. He could conduct them. They had no clue that he completely was very comfortable with the large string section. And you wouldn't know that. That's where his mind was.
To a man, they respected. I remember Ernie Cardos telling me how he rehearsed the string section with vibrato. And to a man, Harry Katzman, Cardos, they had nothing but respect. They were just absolutely stunned.
Many of them and many observers speculating about Glenn Miller after World War II, there has been some speculation that he might have continued on in that vein. With much more of the classics and light classics and that kind of thing if he had lived. It's possible.
I'll tell you, an interesting letter I have. I knew of a fellow that played in the 35 orchestra with Ray Noble. And of course, Glenn was very instrumental in that ensemble. And he was from Lorain, Ohio. And me being from that area, my sister city, I'm from Elyria, Lorain is next door, owned a music shop for years. In the 50s, there was a fellow by the name of Danny DeAndrea, played violin and tenor sax. But gave lessons while Rose did all the day-to-day operation in the music store. I learned he was in the back with rehearsing and giving lessons. But anyway, I did get a letter from Mr. DeAndrea, and it goes back to the Moonlight Serenade, so I'll share it with you. It was kind of humorous, where they were kicking around the name for the tune, and he had a lot of the fellas listening to it, and finally Glenn decided on Pacini's Nose. And Danny writes, Nick Pacini was in our orchestra. He says, Nick was Italian, so is his nose.
Yeah, sir.
Kind of a mechanics question. I was looking at the book of Chesterfield transcripts yesterday in the library, and apparently they were short programs. There were only about 3 songs on them.
15 minutes, sometimes 4. depending on how they programmed
But
it.
they weren't an hour, they were,
15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. These Glen Island things, were they a full concert or were they also kind of short?
Most of the NBC network remotes were 30-minute, but a little less, 28-minute and 45 or 50 seconds. That's how, and at 11:30 at night or midnight or 1 in the morning, they would, were late night broadcasts. However, some of the things we played today were matinees, meaning that earlier in the evening on the Red Network, for whatever reason, they opened up time at like 6:30 p.m. Some of those are half hours, but most are 15 minutes, 6:30 to 6:45. Or 6:45 to 7 p.m. They're earlier evening. And they're interesting broadcasts because there's nobody there. It's just the band. There's no audience because nobody's come to the Glen Island Casino yet. So you get a different feel for what's going on. The sound quality is great because there's no noise in the background of the crowd or the dishes or whatever is going on in the glasses.
So did he actually play long concerts and that they only...
In person.
Well,
not on the air. You're not going to find, there might be, but you're not going to find anything longer than a half an hour.
Okay. But I was just thinking, he was he at this point arranging everything his band did? Because,
No.
doing,
No.
6 programs a week.
This is why he hired Eddie Durham.
Okay.
And to supplement, because he could afford to have Bill Finnegan on staff full-time. But there were other part-time arrangers, Bill Chalice, there were other people that Glenn was hiring on a part-time basis or arrangement by arrangement basis to fill the gaps where he and Finnegan couldn't write it, and Glenn certainly couldn't write everything. And Reinhardt just pointed out to me, and I have to say, I had forgotten, NBC on Saturday afternoons from 5 to 6 would have something called Matinee at the Meadowbrook with Tommy Dorsey in 1940 and 41, where they'd have this hour where Dorsey would go on and on and on. It was a sustaining broadcast, meaning it was not commercially sponsored. Glenn had the Sunset Serenades on NBC Blue on Saturdays, the same time period, 5 to 6 in the fall of 1941. So Glenn did do hour-long programs, the Sunset Serenades dedicated to the service personnel. Those would be the only ones. Good?
Dennis, I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us here today. We thank you for this fountain of knowledge. Where you get it from is beyond my comprehension.